To begin with, let me thank all of you for coming this evening. I'd actually be more comfortable if we were sitting in kind of a circle so we could have a more open discussion. Formal discussions like this tend to be a little stuffy, and I apologize for the setting. But I'd like to take some time to begin with and just give you a brief introduction about who I am and my background and some of the reasons why I've chosen to run for City Council. I've probably been questioned more why I'm running than what I intend to accomplish by running. But just to give you my background, professionally I studied accounting at BYU and have both a bachelor and master's degree in accounting from BYU. And I spent about 10 years in public accounting, the majority of which was involved in governmental audits. I was involved with Alpine School District, Provo City, Utah County, Linden, most of the major municipalities here locally. I also did some auditing in California in the same area. And so I feel very comfortable with governmental accounting and auditing procedures. Subsequently, I took a right turn in my career and went to work for the LDS Church. And over the last number of years, I've had responsibilities primarily in the area of controllership, both in terms of some of the manufacturing facilities within the church and some of the investment areas within the church. So the last 20 years I've spent in the church's investment department and also one of the regulated banks that is owned by the church, Deseret Trust Company. We handle all the deferred gifts that come to the church, as well as administer a lot of the retirement funds through the church insurance companies. Anyway, my primary background is controllership and controlling finances, managing liquidity, and a number of other issues that involve the operations of a fairly large entity. In addition to that, I grew up in Orem. I'm stepping back a little bit. I grew up in Orem. My wife and I met in Orem and raised our family there. We have 2 daughters, both of whom are married. We have 7 grandchildren. We moved to Highland 13 years ago because our home in Orem was not big enough to accommodate our expanding family, which is somewhat ironical when you consider my grandparents expanding to accommodate the growing family that they had. But we felt like it was important to provide a place for our grandchildren to come and spend time. We've loved Highland in the 13 years that we've been here. It's a beautiful community, a beautiful setting. We couldn't ask for better neighbors and a community to live in. However, and this is where I branch off into politics, we moved into an open space subdivision, and during the course of living in Highland, we've had challenges balancing the expectations of the city and our own expectations. During the first probably 7 or 8 years of living in Highland, we did not make any progress. And about 5 years ago, thanks to the willingness of Mayor Ritchie and the City Council at the time, an open space committee was created. And over the course of the last 5 years, the Open Space Committee has been successful in working with the City Council in establishing a number of ordinances that have helped facilitate some of the issues that the open space community has been experiencing since they were first brought into the city. We have not answered all the problems. There's still many to be addressed. But relatively speaking, we feel like we've made significant progress as a committee, and we also owe a lot of gratitude to the City Council and the mayors, both Mayor Ritchie and Mayor Thompson, and how they've been able to help us address some of the issues. Yes?
So we're all kind of in the same community, so what do you consider the open space community? The bike trails and the sidelines of the bike trails?
That's an excellent question. Within Highland, there are 18 open space subdivisions, and you differentiate the open space within those 18 subdivisions versus the other open space that we have within Highland. The other open space would include large areas like some of the existing parks that we have, the cemetery, the parkway easements. The statistics that I have, and definitionally there may be some questions, but there's about 305 acres that came into the city through the open space subdivisions. When you stop and consider that, even at $100,000 an acre, which would be a bargain in today's dollars, that's over $30 million worth of property that was contributed to the city through the 18 open space subdivisions. There's about 250 acres that came in through the purchase or through other means to the city. So there's approximately 550 acres of open space. We get into a little bit of a discussion in terms of how you define that open space. Obviously, a lot of that is unimproved. Some of it is on hillsides and may not be as usable. And that's an area where we still need to spend some time and define what is usable open space and the amount of open space that we need. I'd like to come back to that issue because I think that's a central point of why I'm running for the City Council. And let me skip to that now. Relative to looking at the community as a whole, I've watched the operation of the city for the last 13 years, and from essentially the very get-go of our involvement in that, the city has had a revenue problem. The current City Council and even the previous City Council has done an excellent job cutting costs. And I never want to suggest that they haven't tried as diligently as possible, and I think they've done a great job cutting costs. But you can only cut them so far. And we still have a deficiency in our revenue. And my concern is that we need to balance, one side of that equation. We have expenditure needs up here, we have revenue here. And we can't continue down that same path. It just doesn't work. Eventually, there'll be a day of reckoning when we have to reconcile those two, that imbalance. And from my perspective, we have, as a community, I don't think it's really something that the City Council can do on their own. But as a community, we need to step forward and determine how we're going to address the needs of the community versus the wants of the community. Because I think generally, and I include myself, I personally don't want to pay more property taxes. I'd just as soon not pay more for the services that I receive. But we have to step back and ask ourselves, what do we really want? Do we want all of the open space that we have and the associated cost with that? And if so, are we willing to pay for that? And if not, are we willing to reduce some of that? That's a difficult question. And again, I don't think that's an issue that the City Council can address on their own. But I think that needs to be a forum for discussion that we need to bring forward and determine at what level do we want to be spending within the city. Obviously, we have some limitations on our commercial tax base. That's another issue that we need to at least consider. Personally, I enjoy the residential feel of the community, but at some point in time, taxes will go up inevitably unless we broaden the tax base in one way or another. Or we could reduce services. Sometimes, as a financial person, it becomes almost too fundamental, but in a sense, it really is a simple question. What is our appetite for services versus how much are we going to spend? And that becomes really one of the basic issues that we all need to step forward and address so we make sure that that's in balance. Using the Open Space Committee as an example, a group of citizens, both residents of open space subdivisions and non-residents of open spaces, of the open space areas, have spent the last 5 years resolving issues. And I can assure you there was not uniformity or a unanimous consensus on the direction we needed to go, both in terms of the committee as well as the City Council. And yet over the last 5 years, we've been able to bring ideas and suggestions forward that receive unanimous approval at the City Council level. And I would suggest that we need a similar forum to start addressing some of the imbalance between our revenue and the expenditures that we have within the city. That a very strong citizen committee should be created and start to bring forward some suggestions on how we can address that. Obviously, a very simple way to do that is start liquidating some of the open space that is not being used and is not planned to be used. And part of that process is determining at what level do we want to have open space. And I'm not here to suggest what that level should be. Again, I think that should be something that's more of a consensus within the community. But I think we need to make a decision at one point. Is there a surplus that we can use to pay for debt to help make that transition between the imbalance to a balanced position. Yes?
If you sell the open space, the park land or whatever, what can be done with the money that you get from selling it? Can you use it to pay down the debt?
Yes. In fact, that would be my suggestion. It would be a mistake to take the money that you receive from selling property and use that for operational expenses. I mean, that's the feast and famine concept, and it doesn't really yield anything that's productive. But if we put that money aside and use it to pay down the debt, when it becomes callable or prepayable. Currently, the 3 bonds that we have, the first bond will be callable in 2016. That particular bond has already been refinanced, but my understanding is that there are prepayment provisions that we could start paying that bond down quicker and pay it off. The other 2 bonds become callable in 2017 and 2018. And so I would definitely take a capital asset and apply it to a long-term liability, and which would free up operating cash that we have in the form of property taxes and sales tax revenue, and use that to start applying more of that money towards road repairs and other essential services that the city determines are in fact essential. It's a hard bullet to swallow, but at some point in time as a community we need to make that decision. Where are we going to balance our needs and our capability to fund those needs? I think it's time that we step forward and start making that type of decision. A question in the back?
Yeah, you're talking about sources for revenue. How did you feel on the ordinance for businesses being open on Sunday? And also for services on the library, and the library?
You know, the Sunday closure issue was...
You repeat the question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me restate it and make sure I understand it. You want to know what my position is on the Sunday closure issue, as well as the library. Let me be very clear that I support the vote of the residents, which basically reinstated or continued the closure of businesses on Sunday. And I'll continue to support that until there's a vote by the residents to change it. I don't think that's the position of the City Council to override the vote of the people. I think that's a critical distinction between the rights of the City Council, which they technically have the right to do that, but I would never support that without a consensus of the residents again. As far as the library is concerned, I feel like the library is a very beneficial service for the community. And I don't believe that we can ignore that as an essential service within the community. The library has a number of reading programs that are extremely beneficial to the community as a whole. It creates a culture of education within the community, which I strongly support. I continue to pay property taxes on my home for Alpine School District, and we haven't had a child in the Alpine School District for longer than I would want to admit, a long time. But I think that's an investment in the future. The amount that we pay for the current Highland City Library is about 3% of the overall budget. And so when you start looking at the amount that we dedicate for the library, it's pretty insignificant. And so I believe that's one of our responsibilities to pay it forward and support the library. When I grew up in Orem was probably about the same place Highland is today. And I remember the first library that was opened in Orem. It was actually on the corner of where the current city center is at. And it was an old, almost dilapidated building. The floor squeaked, and it was really, in today's standard, it probably would have been condemned. But it was a delightful experience to go to the library, and it was used a lot. I think our current library here in Highland is also used a lot. I don't have the current statistics, but in previous years there's been, I want to say over 60,000 visits per year, and Richard, you would know better what that currently is. And so that's a service that's offered by the community that probably, the only thing that would outstrip that in user interaction would be the utility services that are offered within the city. Did that answer your question? Yes. Let's see, was there a question over here first?
Okay, Ruth Lowe's and our control leader has a question.
Okay.
What is one issue that has affected you?
Pardon?
What what is one issue that affects our community?
What is one issue that affects our community? I'll try not to give one that I've already talked about, but let me move to another area that I think is also important for the community, and that's the level of involvement with the city has with development of residential areas and businesses. The one thing that I've experienced is that the city is very prescriptive. Over the course of the city's development and ordinances, we continue to add ordinances, but we never take any away. And consequently, we've become extremely prescriptive. When you look at the businesses that we have in Highland, it's taken significant effort and cost for them to locate here. My best example is Neaters. And as you all know, Neaters is not in Highland. The owners of Neaters actually live in Highland and tried for a fairly significant amount of time to locate here in Highland, and ultimately opted to locate to Lehigh because they could do that at a much cheaper cost with essentially the same benefit. That's the type of commercial development I don't think Highland can afford to lose. Neaters would be a wonderful addition to our community, and we need to make it more attractive to those type of businesses to locate in Highland. Yes?
So you supporting rezoning?
I do, and let me explain, elaborate that just a little bit more. The question is, do I support rezoning? Let me start on the residential side. I think that's an area that we need to decide as well. Highland is, at least, there's the concept that Highland is predominantly R140, which is a half an acre to an acre lot. Well, in fact, there are probably just as many R120 subdivisions as there are R140, and the R120 is a quarter to a half an acre. When I drive through the community and get the feel and look of the difference between an R120 and an R140, there's very little difference, particularly on the frontage side. Most of the property involving the R140 subdivisions is in the backyard, which you typically don't see unless it happens to be adjacent to a highway. And so I think it's important that we balance R140 and R120 zoning so that we have a good mix of that going forward. That's obviously going to increase the potential build-out population for Highland. But there's also the added benefit of additional property taxes, addition to the community of wonderful people. So I think that's one area that we need to seriously look at. Another area is zoning for commercial development. That is a very sensitive issue, and I would acknowledge that it is very sensitive, and that's something we need to address very carefully. But you'll notice Lehigh and Cedar Hills have developed very successful commercial areas adjacent to Highland, literally across the street. The consequence of that is we have all the infrastructure impact, but we don't get the direct benefit. And the direct benefit, if I could explain that, sales tax is generated within the community. You receive 50% of the city portion of that sales tax. And I believe that's half of 1%. And then the other half of a percent is shared based on population across the community. So we do get some of the benefit of that sales tax. But there's a fairly significant differential. That's not going to solve our problems, but that could go a long ways to helping them. And it's a shame that we have very successful commercial developments across the street, and yet don't welcome those same commercial developments within the city. And I would never suggest that we should have commercial development throughout the city. I think we can do that very strategically and have very little impact on the community. There's an area across the street from the cemetery that's not surrounded by residential area. There's some across the street further to the west and further to the east, but that would be one area that we should look at, and it's fairly adjacent to the Smiths complex. There's another area south of Lone Peak High School that's currently owned by the state, which we don't have much control over. But those are at least two possible areas. Another area that we would want to consider is potential professional commercial development. doctors, dentists, professional businesses, software firms that have very little nighttime impact on our community, but add a commercial tax base. You had a question?
I'm just concerned that we don't want to lose the farming area where those longhorn cattle are. I think that all of Utah needs to be concerned about leaving the open farmland as farmland.
Mm-hmm. I don't disagree with you. Ultimately, that will be sold. That's the unfortunate part of that. When I grew up in Orem, I think today you think of Orem as just a city of sidewalks and no open space, but I grew up adjacent to a church welfare farm. They raised apples and cherries, and I spent most of my growing up years playing in the apple and cherry orchards, and that was delightful. And I think that's a wonderful situation that we can provide for our families. And so I'm in favor of that, but we also have to look at what is inevitable and make sure we manage accordingly so that we take advantage of some of the benefits that we can all derive. The bottom line is, and I apologize for using bottom line, that's too sterile. The ultimate impact is that we can choose between adding a stronger commercial tax base or ultimately paying more in taxes. And I would suggest that it's going to be beneficial if we're selective in what we bring into the community, that we proactively address that so that we can provide a beneficial tax base that will help all of us. And that's a around the park kind of an answer, but I empathize with the need to have open space and an area where it is beautiful to live. I back up to about close to 30 acres of pasture and alfalfa and grain fields. It's the Reinhardt property. It's a beautiful area to live behind, and I don't look forward to the day when they decide to develop that property, but they are going to. That's inevitable.
It's inevitable that we need to eat.
It is. It is. Yes.
I was very happy to hear you say that you would support the current policy on Sunday closure.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that there are other ways to bring commercial into the city without opening up on Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
With that being off the table, what are other ways that we can attract commercial to Highland?
Well, to start with, as I already mentioned, we've got to make it less prescriptive. We've got to invite businesses in, and we've got to actively market for those businesses. If we know that there's a business that wants to locate here, we need to do everything we can to accommodate that while not compromising some of the core values of the city. For example, the Arctic Circle that's over on the Alpine Highway. That was built in a way that blends in fairly well with the community, and yet I think is a very successful commercial business that's coming to Highland. So I think we need to have more of an economic development plan and an economic development group within the city to attract businesses that will add value to the community. And again, I think if you look at what Alpine has done, they've been very successful at bringing in professional offices and businesses that have very little negative impact on the community. Most of their offices are very attractive, and that's an area where we could do a significant amount of benefit to the city with very little negative impact. Yes, I think you were first.
Can you just be a little more specific? You keep saying it's prescriptive and kind of in general.
Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example, and I bring this up not as a criticism of the current city council because this is an ordinance that they inherited, but there is actually an ordinance on the books that prescribes how much of a window can be covered in advertising. That's a classic case that we need to let businesses run their business the way they want to run it. If they want to cover up a window with an advertisement, that's their prerogative. Also, the process of actually getting a business through the Planning Commission and through the City Council is extremely laborious and difficult to do. We have members of the Planning Commission and the City Council here. And I think that they've made a concerted effort to be more accommodating. So again, I think in working around what they currently have, they've done a good job trying to accommodate as much as they can. But I think we need to be more specific and start getting those more prescriptive ordinances off the books, so that we can invite people to the community.
2 minutes, sir.
There's questions over here.
Well,
Yes.
mine was the same one, but I mean, I'm not understanding, advertising of a window would keep a business out? What?
No, it doesn't keep a business out, but it's to the level of being prescriptive to the point of being almost obsessive over what you're asking a business to do.
So what is the main issue that most businesses like Leaders are locating? What is it that are we charging too much money for building fees, or what are we doing that they're not coming in?
The process of making an application, going through all the approval processes, all the screening, just takes a significant amount of time. I've heard up to as much as 2 years. The tire company that's in the town center, the report that I have is they almost went bankrupt trying to get their business located within the city. Fortunately, they hung in there and got it done. And so the process is very expensive and takes a very long time to do. And again, the current city council has tried to make that more streamlined. And so I would, again, give them credit for recognizing that, but I think we need to be more proactive so that the city council doesn't have to intervene at the level that they've had to intervene to get businesses in the city. One more question, and then I better sit down.
I've got a couple of points. One, we've got businesses, granted they're in Lehigh, that have got people going to lunch. If you've ever gone to lunch over on the other side of Lehigh around noon, the place is, you can't move. We have got room here for places to eat, and we need some decent places to have lunches or dinners, a nice dinner, and I think they could be very successful even not being open on Sunday. As the government insists on moving in here in mass and computer industry, we're going to have, our homes are going up in value, you're going to get your taxes, and there are going to be more and more people moving into Iowa, and they're going to want the places to eat. That's one of the big things. The other thing, I want to know where you stand on Proposition 1.
Okay, let me address the restaurants first. I agree with you completely, and that's really what's driving my whole discussion about being more inviting for businesses. Neaters would have located in Highland had it not been so difficult to locate in Highland. And we need to provide a business environment and a city regulatory environment that is inviting to residents or to restaurants and businesses that would add value to the community. Proposition 1, interesting proposition. We need to do something with roads. Unfortunately, using Proposition 1 to do that, I think, is a mistake. And let me explain why. If you compare that to a federal level, we've added a whole bunch of earmarks to Proposition 1. Because I think the original intent was to provide more funding for roads, which we, as a state, we need to address that. And the state is recognizing that and providing some additional funding. Proposition 1 was intended to do that as well, but we've added earmarks that we need to address separately. In other words, if we're going to combine road repairs and UTA, those are two very distinct issues, and I think they should be voted on separately, not combined. And so I'm personally opposed to it because of that. I think we need to be able to look at each individual separately and vote on them separately, so that everyone has a voice on each issue separately.
Because the city's only allowed 20% of that money. I think people just think we'll finally get our roads fixed. We're not going to get our roads fixed.
It isn't the answer that we need. We still need a solution, but I think we need a better solution than Proposition 1 provides. Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone coming and